There's an historical account of a naval skirmish between the French and English, which took place in the early 1700s. An English admiral whose ship lay off the coast of France was there awaiting his orders. And while he anchored, he didn't want his men growing, restless with inactivity. And so he ordered his men to practice firing their cannon at a nearby French castle. Now, in typical French fashion, the castle was adorned around the top of it with statues of patron saints. And for several hours, these men spent their time in the harbor firing cannonball after cannonball at these ornate statues of patron saints around the top of the castle walls. But then suddenly, without warning, they were called to go to war. And the orders came so quickly that they were prevented from replenishing their ship with ammunition. And they had to set sail immediately. Well, you can imagine what happened. I mean, this ship ended up being defeated and captured, not because they were outmanned or outmaneuvered by the enemy, but because they ran out of ammunition. They had spent so much of it shooting at the patron saints atop the walls of this castle. You see, one of the greatest problems that the modern church faces, and even the church at the time of James' writing, is not the world around us or out there, but the world in here, so to speak. The world within the church walls. Believer against believer. Brother against brother. Sister against sister. Firing away, so to speak, at our fellow saints. Paul asked the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 3, this question. He said, "For since there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly, and are you not walking like mere men?" You see, the Galatian church was allowing bitter wrangling to go on within their congregation. And Paul said that they were in danger of consuming one another in Galatians chapter 5, verse 15. In fact, Paul challenged the church in Ephesus to work hard excuse me, at developing spiritual unity. He said, you need to work hard at developing that unity. And then in his letter to the Philippian congregation, Paul even named 2 women in that church at Philippi who couldn't get along. Their names were Euodia and Syntyche. Euodia and Syntyche. J. Vernon McGee, who is a great preacher and who's now gone, to add some humor when he was talking about this or preaching about it, renamed Euodia and Syntyche odious and soon touchy. And I think that probably was a better fitting description of those 2 women when it came to each other. You see, the problems of strife and jealousy go all the way back to a family that's been exiled from the Garden of Eden. And you'll remember that in this first family, Cain grew jealous of Abel until his jealousy and bitter rivalry resulted in his murdering of his very own brother. Now, you would never imagine that someone like Cain would ever come to church and much less join it. And yet, some of the most shocking words from the lips of James are about to be heard in the church about the church. James chapter 4 opens with a stunning and shocking disclosure. Beginning in verse 1, James says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your bodies or your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives so that you may spend it on your pleasures. Now, after reading that, your first thought probably is, surely James isn't talking about Christians here, is he? I mean, there's no way, right? How could people in the church act like that? Well, the question is, what does James mean when he uses the terms quarrels and conflicts? Well, the word quarrels refers to a long state of hostility, a long period. And the word conflicts refers to specific outbursts of hostility that happen between people. And if you go back to chapter 3, verse 13, which we just got done studying, James asks, and here it is, who, keywords, among you is wise and understanding. And then here in chapter 4, verse 1, James refers to quarrels and conflicts where? Among you. Same phrase in chapter 3, verse 13, when he asks, who among you is wise and understanding? And then here in chapter 4, quarrels and conflicts among you. It's the very same phrase. Now, there are some who try to argue that James is writing to unbelievers here when he talks about quarrels and conflicts among you. In other words, there were unbelievers who were creating this quarreling and conflict within the church. But the clincher is found down in verse 11, where he specifically identifies his audience as brethren. You see, that designation or reference to brethren is always and only reserved for believers or Christians. James is writing here to the church at large. And like Paul's words to the church at Corinth in his second letter, 2 Corinthians, where he wrote, I am afraid that perhaps when I come there will be strife, jealousy, angry tempers, disputes, slanders, disturbances. Now the question is this, is James talking about a church service or a hockey game when he describes this? And if you've ever watched a hockey game on TV, and better yet, if you've ever been able to go to a live game and see it in person, especially when you have a game between bitter rivals, I mean, fights begin to break out all over the place, and it's usually one fight after another. I mean, they can't go a minute without another fight breaking out. And things can get so heated that even the goalies will skate out to center ice, take off their masks, drop their gloves, and they go at it. And I mean, boy, do the fans love it. They go berserk watching these fights take place. Now, you expect that out on the ice during a hockey game, but not in the church, do we? Could there be such bitter rivalries among believers, among Christians? Could there be such jealousy and selfishness and envy and hostility and lustful desires that the church could digress and lives be destroyed? Well, the answer, according to James, is yes, absolutely. But James wants to go behind the scenes, behind the answer, and find out what starts this kind of fiasco in the first place anyway. You know, it's kind of like the 6th grade teacher who didn't see which kid threw the first punch while all the kids were waiting in line to go in to class after recess. All he or she saw was two kids rolling around in the dirt, fighting it out, just like two hockey goalies. And when the teacher finally gets control of the situation, he or she asks one question. Okay, young men, I want to know who started it. Well, he punched me in the nose. Yeah, but he came after me and threw the first punch. And you know, what usually happens is they both spend the rest of the day in the principal's office negotiating a peace treaty. But both of them are guilty of fighting. However, the one who started it would be considered the guiltier of the two, since the other person may have been only involved for the sake of self-defense. And that's exactly what James wants to find out here. How did this start? What's behind this? Now, I want you to notice the first words in verse 1, which we read earlier. James says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you?" Just like this teacher asking those two sixth graders, okay, who started it? What's going on here? So James says, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? In other words, who started it? Let's get to the bottom of it. Let's cut to the chase. And what James will do in these next few verses is show us three internal sources that contribute to external conflict. Three internal sources that contribute or lead to external conflict. Now, here's the bad news. You got in trouble in the church? Well, the trouble begins with you. The bad news is, if you got in trouble in the church, the trouble is that it begins with you. The very first source of conflict that James describes here can simply be called shameful desires. Number one is shameful desires. That's the first of three internal sources of external conflict. Number one, shameful desires. Now, the middle part of verse 1, he says, is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members, that is, in your body, is not the source your pleasures, James asks. Now, the word pleasures is the Greek word hedonai, from which we get our word hedonist or hedonism. You see, hedonism was a moral perspective that was established in Greece 400 years before the birth of Christ by a philosopher named Aristippus, the Cyrene. And he taught that whatever pleasure seems natural to a person constitutes good, and they should seek after it. It should be sought after. In fact, with the climate of our current culture in America, he would be considered a bestseller if he was alive today. Now, he may have formalized this idea or this concept, but he didn't invent it. Hedonism happens to be the most popular philosophy of life on this planet. Whatever feels good is good. Whatever's right for you is right. I mean, how can it be wrong when it feels so right? You know, somebody ought to write a song about that, right? Hedonism is the belief that pleasure is the chief good in life. If it's pleasing or fun or exciting or pleasurable, then it must be good. But you know, the interesting thing is that whenever this word appears in the New Testament, it always appears in a sinful or shameful context. For example, in Luke chapter 8, verse 14, Jesus describes people who walk away from the demands of discipleship, of following God and being obedient, as people who are choked by life's pleasures. In Titus chapter 3, verse 3, Paul refers to people as enslaved by various kinds of lust and pleasures. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13, Peter referred to false teachers who count it a pleasure to revel in their sin. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 through 4, the Apostle Paul described the hedonist in the clearest of terms when he wrote this. He says, they are lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Now, don't misunderstand. James is not suggesting that pleasure itself is wrong. You can find pleasure in playing with your children or grandchildren, or in taking a walk, watching a sunrise or a sunset, enjoying the pleasure of your spouse, sitting on the porch with you during a rainfall, or, reading a book or fishing on a quiet morning. We could go on and on. But we need to understand that all pleasures and desires are not evil. It's specifically what we desire which determines whether something is wrong or right, or whether something is evil or good. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 73, verse 25, "Whom have I in heaven but thee, and there is nothing upon earth I desire beside thee." 1 Corinthians 14:1, desire earnestly spiritual gifts. Philippians 1:23, I desire, Paul says, to depart and be with Christ. 1 Timothy 3:1, in writing to Timothy, his son in the faith, Paul says, if any man aspires to the office of elder, it is a fine work, meaning to the office of pastor. It's a fine work he desires. But this word that's chosen here by James, hedonai, is the dark side of desire. These are the shameful desires of forbidden pleasure, and we can blame it all on the devil. We blame it all on Satan, right? But I want you to look again at verse 1. James asks, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? He says, is not the source your own pleasures that wage war in your members, that is, in your own body? You see, we give the devil, we give Satan way too much credit for our sin. And James informs us here that we've actually got a war going on inside of us internally. See, pleasure is waging war against our spirit, our new nature that God has given us at salvation. Immoral pleasures, evil desires, self-centered plans, wicked thoughts are at war with our spirit, this new nature, to see who gains control. In fact, the words translated wage war that James uses here comes from a Greek word that can literally be translated an armed camp. An armed camp. You see, we happen to have camping within our fallen flesh, our bodies, an army of desires that are constantly plotting, maneuvering, and attacking so that they can gain control over our lives. One Greek scholar put it this way. This word refers to a military expedition where the passions of the flesh are described as constantly fighting to have their way, to be victorious over the spirit, over the new nature which Jesus Christ has given us at salvation. You see, there's a war going on inside of us every single day. The Apostle Peter used the same word that James uses here when he warned believers in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. He said, Beloved, I urge you as aliens, and aliens is basically strangers in this evil world. He says, I urge you as aliens, as strangers, to abstain from what? Fleshly lust, which wage war against the soul. Very same term that James uses. Listen, one of the worst things you can tell someone is that when they come to Christ Jesus as their Lord and Savior, that everything will just calm down and settle down in life, that it's just going to be perfect. No, that is not the case. You see, when you come to Christ and you want to live as a Christian and serve Him, that's when the real battle in life begins. And the shocking truth is this: you are at war with yourself, and so am I with myself. And shameful desires are constantly trying to win the day in each of our lives. And that's not all. James goes on to give us the second source of conflict, the second cause of our conflicts. And this is where we'll pick up with our study next week.